Imagine waking up before dawn. You pick up two wooden buckets. You walk through streets that smell like you wouldn't believe. You knock on doors, collect what's inside, and carry it out of the city on your back every single day. You are the reason the people around you don't die of disease. Nobody thanks you. Nobody remembers you because there's a job that kept every ancient city alive. And when civilization started writing down its history, it left the people who did it out almost entirely. This is the job history tried to forget. Right now, somewhere in your home, there's a toilet. You use it, you flush it, and the problem disappears. You don't think about where it goes. You don't have to. But for roughly 99% of human history, that problem didn't disappear. It sat there, it piled up, it ran through the streets, seeped into the wells, and floated in the rivers people drank from. And the moment humans started living in cities, real cities, with thousands of people packed into narrow streets, that problem became the difference between civilization surviving and civilization drowning in its own waste. So someone had to deal with it, and that someone had a name. In medieval Europe, they were called gong farmers. In Japan, they were known as night soil men. In China, they were called the ash cart men. Different cultures, different centuries, same job. They came at night when everyone else was asleep, and they emptied the cesspits, the privies, the buckets people kept under their beds. They carried it out of the city on their backs or in carts, and they sold it to farmers who used it as fertilizer. It was one of the most economically important jobs in the ancient world. It was also one of the most invisible. Let's start with why it was necessary, because the scale of this problem is hard to picture. By 1800, London had about 1 million people. Each person produces roughly 100 grams of solid waste per day. That's 100,000 kilograms of human waste being generated in one city every single day. And London in 1800 had almost no sewers. What it had instead were cesspits, holes dug beneath houses and streets where waste collected. When they filled up, and they filled up constantly, someone had to empty them by hand. The gong farmers of medieval England worked exclusively at night by law. They weren't allowed to work during the day because the smell was considered too offensive for polite society. They worked from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. They descended into cesspits that were sometimes 20 feet deep. They shoveled the contents into buckets, hauled those buckets up by rope, loaded them into carts, and transported them outside the city walls before dawn. Picture what that actually meant. No gloves, no mask, no ventilation. Just a candle, a rope, and a bucket at the bottom of a hole that hadn't been opened in months. The smell alone was enough to make grown men pass out before they even reached the bottom. And they did this every night, in the cold and the dark, while the city slept above them completely unaware. The fine for dumping waste within the city limits was severe, so they moved fast, worked in silence, and were gone before anyone woke up, like they were never there. The pay was actually reasonable by the standards of the time. In 14th century England, a gong farmer could earn sixpence per night, several times the wage of an ordinary laborer. Dangerous, disgusting, socially untouchable work, paid well precisely because nobody else would do it. But the money came with a cost that went beyond the smell. The health risks were catastrophic. Cesspits produced methane and hydrogen sulfide gas. Men working at the bottom of a deep pit with no ventilation could lose consciousness within minutes. Some never came back up. In 1326, four gong farmers in London suffocated in a cesspit on Newgate Street. The records show it wasn't unusual. This was an occupational hazard so common it barely warranted comment. You descended into the pit, understanding that the pit might keep you. But medieval England wasn't the first civilization to face this problem. Rome faced it 1,000 years earlier and handled it very differently. At its peak, the city of Rome had over 1 million people living within its walls. The Romans were famous for their engineering, and they did build the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewer systems, originally constructed to drain the swampy ground beneath the city. But here's what the history books leave out. The Cloaca Maxima served the wealthy districts and the public baths. For the vast majority of Romans living in towering apartment blocks called insulae, there was no sewer connection at all. You used a chamber pot, and when it was full, the law technically required you to take it to a designated dump site. In practice, many people simply opened their window and threw it into the street below. There were actual laws in Rome about walking close to buildings at night to avoid being hit. The men who collected waste from the streets and public latrines were called the stercorari. They operated the same way gong farmers would centuries later, moving through the city before dawn, largely unseen, selling what they collected to farms outside the city. Roman farmers valued human waste so highly that a legal market developed around it. Contracts were drawn up, prices were negotiated. One of the most powerful empires in history ran partly on a supply chain that began in a chamber pot, and yet the job was hereditary in many cultures. In Japan, the night soil trade was organized into guilds. Families controlled specific routes through cities and towns, collecting waste from assigned households in exchange for payment or reduced rent. The routes were inherited from father to son across generations. In some regions, the competition between night soil guilds was intense enough to require official arbitration. There were legal disputes over who had the right to collect waste from a particular street. This was property worth fighting over. Here's the part that almost nobody knows. The night soil trade wasn't just about sanitation. It was a critical part of the agricultural economy. Human waste, what the Japanese called shimogoe, literally below fertilizer, was extraordinarily valuable to farmers. It was rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. In 18th century Japan, the contents of a wealthy household's cesspit were worth significantly more than the contents of a poor household's, because wealthy people ate better and their waste was more nutritious for crops. Landlords in Osaka sometimes reduced tenants' rent in exchange for rights to their waste. Night soil collectors paid households for the privilege of taking what most people considered worthless. The system worked so efficiently in Japan that Edo, modern day Tokyo, which by the early 1700s had a population of over 1 million people, was one of the cleanest large cities in the world at the time. While European cities were drowning in filth, Edo had an almost closed loop waste system. Human waste left the city, fed the farms surrounding it, and returned as food. Nothing was wasted. The people who made that system work were never celebrated. They were barely acknowledged, but without them, the city doesn't function. Then the 19th century arrived and everything changed. Modern sewage systems were built. Chemical fertilizers replaced organic waste. The night soil trade collapsed within a generation. The job that had existed in every major civilization for thousands of years simply disappeared. And with it, the people who had done it faded from history almost completely. Here's what stays with me. Every city you've ever read about, Rome, Constantinople, medieval London, ancient Edo, had these people moving through it in the dark. The historians were writing about emperors and generals and philosophers. Meanwhile, before the sun came up, someone was making sure the city they lived in didn't kill them. They kept civilization alive from the bottom up. And civilization, in return, forgot they existed.